Roll call, please.
Buddy Bogan.
Here.
Jim Callahan.
Here.
Kevin Donovan.
Here.
David Edmonds.
Here.
Carolyn Turner, absent. Mike Ventresca.
Here.
Chair Bob Doherty.
Here. Before the meeting begins, please silence your cell phones and note that this meeting is being recorded. First item, we have no A&Rs or anything?
We do not.
It's okay. First matter before the board is public hearing on a zoning amendment to repeal in its entirety Section 10 of the Woburn zoning ordinance entitled Cluster Development and to mark Section 10 as reserved for future use, sponsored by Councilors DeMambro and Mercer Bruin, and they're here tonight, and if they'd like to speak. Yeah, please.
Good evening, everyone. For the record, Darlene Mercer Bruin, 22 Richard Circle, and also City Councilor Ward 5. Oh,
Good evening, board members. Lou DeMambro, Ward Councilor for Ward 6, 210 School Street, Woburn.
I'd like to first start out by saying thank you all for putting this matter on your agenda. And I'd also like to apologize. Normally, something like this, I would reach out, and I did not, and I did that intentionally. Because we have some concerns, but we also know as planners, you have a lot of experience in these matters. So we're hoping to have an unbiased conversation. I didn't want to try to influence it before it even happened, hoping to share our concerns with you and then have a conversation. So the one thing we do know about planning, we've, know that it's about balance. And I think over the course of many years, I think Woburn, this board, and Ed Torello before you did an amazing job of striking the right balance. We have many single-family residential neighborhoods. We have condominium complexes. We have apartment buildings. Long before the state started talking about the lack of housing, this city, you, Tina, and this board said, we need to do something now, and that was 10 years ago. And with the city council, I think we've done that. So I thank you all for your guidance there. As you know, recently, the cluster development ordinance hasn't been used very often. In fact, I think just once, and it's a pretty amazing development. You also know that, probably not for Councilor DeMambro, but I've been here a long time, and there's a variety of developments that I've supported, some not, but supported many different developments, whether they were, I've never really had an opportunity to support a neighborhood residential development, because those don't typically come to us, but a variety of them. And recently, when the cluster development came up, there were many concerns. And that's okay, it's by special permit, we expressed our concerns. But it got us thinking, me in particular, on this one matter. I've seen a trend and heard about a trend in our neighborhoods where big corporations are purchasing single-family homes. And I don't mean LLCs, I mean big major corporations that you can't even find who runs it, and not from around here. I hear these concerns from my constituents who say, oh, this house next door just got sold to this big so I've heard it a few times. And what came to my attention as we were discussing this previous possible cluster development, somebody said to me, well, it'll be impossible for many of these to happen because you need to get to 5 acres. How are you ever going to get to 5 acres? And I thought, you get there with patience and money. So that was one of my biggest concerns, seeing that trend in real estate. My second concern, I know that Councilor DeMambro and I share this concern, is about the balance. We know, in fact, that there will probably be 3 or 4 more of these come our way. Fortunately, by special permit, we can decide if it's appropriate or not. But the question now becomes, is it appropriate at all if we already have what we believe to be a good balance in our city, and with the looming DHCD situation that we all know is hanging over our head. So that's sort of how we came to be here. I also know that when you take away an ordinance, that can obviously trigger things like freezing zoning and those sorts of things. So we go into this with eyes wide open, but primarily with the concern of what does it look like 6 years from now for those people who are patiently accumulating, who don't even live in our city. The cost of the property is so expensive. I understand why you would want to do these sorts of developments, and maybe it's not very popular to build single-family neighborhoods anymore, but at the end of the day, having that combination is what makes Woburn Woburn. So that's it. That's why we're here. I know Councilor DeMambro has many other thoughts too, but thank you for listening, and look forward to hearing your feedback, and thank you.
To expand on what my colleague said, I have a lot of trepidation when it comes to these cluster developments, especially up in North Woburn. We already know it's a densely populated area. We know that the city of Woburn is in high demand, especially when it comes to having people move here. People want to reside here. People want to live here. People want to work here. 400 years ago, we had hundreds and thousands of acreage. We don't have that anymore. We're down to parcels, and we see that through popularity and people wanting to be here, those parcels are shrinking. The land mass is shrinking. So the cluster developments I see are going to become, more in demand as time goes on, because we're not going to have these larger parcels to put in housing developments. So this is kind of like, the slow ride to, housing developments by accumulating these little parcels and stitching them together to make 5-6 acres to develop. A problem with that is they're not going to be building the R1s. They're going to be, not even the R2s. They're going to more probably lean towards the 3s and the 4s. And before you know it, these clusters, they're going to demand more 3s and 4s than 1s and 2s, for the land that they have, and what's allocated and what's on the books and how they can build it. I just don't think it's right for the residents, in these residential neighborhoods and areas, that all of a sudden these little parcels that were stitched together over a period of 5-10 years, next thing they know, they have 30-40 units on a 5-acre parcel. And I understand the way it's written, that it states, well, you gain 30% in open space, but, let's get right down to it. That open space is ledge, boulders, rocks, mountainous areas, and wetlands. It's not like it's used for light recreation. It's not like kids can play wiffle ball in that area. People can take walks with their dog. You can't use any of that. And the other concern I have is, and everybody wants open space, but nobody wants to take care of it. Who's going to maintain the forestry in the wetlands when the litter and the debris from recycling containers dumping over and falling into these areas, people's yard waste that they say, well, instead of putting it in a bag and putting it on the curb, I'm going to just start dumping it in the woods like we have over there at Middlesex Canal. These are all concerns of mine, and I just think with these clusters, I think that, will create some more of these problems that already exist. So I would strongly, ask that this board consider repealing Section 10 in the ordinances. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Any Well, this is a public hearing. Well, does anybody from the board have any questions at this moment? Claudia?
So I'm trying to find a date of enactment of this, and I saw 1988 on here. Tina, is that kind of where we're?
It was actually a little bit before 1988, but in 1988, they made an amendment to it. And shortly after they made that amendment, there was the application that Councilor Bruin mentioned. It was Quail Run, we think, off of Russell Street was the development that was done under the cluster. And that's, to my knowledge and Tom Quinn's, the only one that's happened under the ordinance. So mid-'80s, it was on the books, amended late '80s, and then the units in the development, I think, are like 1990 era date of construction.
Okay, that's actually really helpful, because I live over in West Woburn and pass Quail Run frequently, so I'm somewhat familiar with it. And if memory serves, there is, quite a bit of open space designed in there that seems usable,
Yes, forested.
things of this
Buffer.
nature. So, but clearly that wasn't, to the counselor's concern, a stitched-together parcel of land. That seems to be, it was there, one thinks,
I think so.
without doing what you guys are talking about, which is taking from a neighborhood, stitching together small parcels, getting enough land in the middle of some other zoning district, and then building, a big thing. So, okay, that's helpful. Because when I look at the purposes of what this was designed for, I don't know if it was, clearly this is even before my time, amazing, but true, right? I don't know whether the cluster development, sometimes when we get zoning, right, it's for a particular issue, it's for a particular concern that, folks who are bringing it convince folks that, oh, well, this is just not for this one project, right, but it's for more projects in the future. I don't know if this came about that way. But the purposes of it are essentially open space, creative site planning, economical development, aesthetics, uses less land per dwelling unit. So kind of all of them except the last one, one would wonder about, what is it, almost not 30
Plus years.
plus years later. It seemed to, the reason seemed to be essentially aesthetics and open space. And the concern about the open space is, well, what open space? Like, there's not, I haven't looked at this ordinance super closely, but I don't know if there's, and Tina, maybe you can help me, some sort of provision that the open space be usable or,
At least X
high
percent.
quality, as opposed to simply nothing's on it, right? Other than natural implements, shall we say. So am I right?
I think you're right.
There's nothing in the ordinance that talks about, well, this is the sort of open space we mean. And that's probably to the counselor's point, right? That as long as nothing's built on it, it kind of qualifies, which is your concern, or one of them, that I'm hearing. So the only thing that the purpose, under the current purposes, uses less land per dwelling unit than permitted. And I guess the question today is, we do need housing in the city, but that's a really general purpose, right? There's not any one of these purposes that says, well, it encourages, housing that as a city we want to see.
Right.
So that's a concern. For the moment, that's all I have. It's not really a question, it's just more of an observation as to what I'm seeing in response to what the presentation was of the concerns. Do I generally have the idea? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Jim?
Yes, to the counselors, do we have any idea of the tracts of land that are out there that are being grouped together currently? that would be adversely affected by this if it was repealed. You know, like anything that you do, you know, there's the counterpoint to it, and we want to make sure we're looking at it from both sides of the aisle. And is there someone going down that path? I don't have that sense that there is currently, could be wrong, but, you know, you're looking at a lot of areas that have the potential, especially up in North Woburn that I know Alderman DeMambro is referring to. But one of the things, if the board's gonna take a crack at this, is some of the language that's lacking, like Claudia mentioned earlier, is the access to these tracts of property. All right, if you want to put in a development, okay, and they meet the criteria and the aesthetics and all the 4 requirements they have, how do they access that property? Because Woburn right now, in its previous iterations of zoning, have allowed industrial parks to go through neighborhoods, as we all know. We're still currently dealing with it. So there are things like that that have to be considered. And if we do modify or repeal or leave alone, some of that language should be considered for future reference. That's all. Thank you. If you ever reply, welcome.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Shelley.
Yeah, you can go first.
So in terms of, is there anyone who's looking at doing this? I would say probably, but I'd also like to point out that the chamber is relatively empty. And if it were that important, perhaps they might have shown up. Now, that doesn't mean maybe they had things going on, and I don't want to say it's this person, this person, this person, because nobody has submitted anything. It's purely speculation. But at the end of the day, I would like to reiterate that this ordinance has not been used for a very, very long time. And the cost of property has skyrocketed. So if you have deep pockets and you can purchase a home here, a home here, a home there, a home there, before you know it, you're up to 5 acres. It doesn't take that long to get there. So that's my concern with this entire ordinance. And again, I have been through the process of reversing an ordinance many, many years ago over at what is now, Chick-fil-A. And so I understand about the possibility of freezing. I go into this eyes wide open. But the thing that brought me comfort is the way that it's written. It does require a special permit. So for that reason, I'm not as concerned. Thank you.
I would also like to just bring up, as a matter of concern, and Jimmy, you kind of, you tripped it up inside my head. With these already dense areas, up in like North Woburn, when you start you take a 15,000 square foot parcel and you stack it up and put a 3 or a 4 family in there, with a 3 or 4 family, unit, say there's 4 people, that's anywhere from 12 to 16 people just in one building. And I understand that, through my colleagues on the city council, we propose conditions, and Superintendent Duran and Inspector Commissioner Quinn, they tell these developers what they can and cannot do and what they must do in order to get these buildings, and I get it. But we already have a tax system. And when you start taking an already taxed system in a taxed area, even if you were to replace 200 or 300, 500 feet of pipe or drainage or whatever, by putting in these cluster developments, another thing that concerns me is, there's less of an impervious, footprint, because now you're stacking these dwellings. You're not so much going out left, right, center. You're going straight up. And we've seen it. We're seeing it. We have things at the council now that they're trying to even expand on 4 and 5 families and rebuild them. And they've been a concern since their inception. My concern is if we were to continue down this road with this ordinance, if this should gain traction and more developers sink their teeth into this saying, well, because land is such a scarcity in Woburn, but there's such a high demand and we can make buku money on it, we're willing to go ahead with this and spend the money. Unfortunately, it's the residents that have been existing in these neighborhoods 20, 30, 40 years, generationally, some of them, they're going to sit there and go, what's going on? And my other concern with not only, our infrastructure getting taxed, I'm noticing more and more since I've been on the council, which is a brief amount of time, I'm going into my 3rd year, 2nd term. I find that a lot of these developments, even through peer reviews and everything else, the way they're laid out, they say there's substantial parking. There's not. So when you have 16 people living in one building, I'm going to say you're going to have 16 vehicles. I don't care how you slice it. Where are you going to put 16 vehicles when a driveway holds 4 cars? They're going to go on the street. Now we have a snow ban. I'm getting inundated with phone calls from developments that have been recently built. I can't believe you're making me take my car off the street. I got my car towed. It's like, well, there's a snow ban. Well, where do you expect me to put my car? This is a big concern. You start taking and lining, streets up because there's an abundance of 3 and 4 family homes and all of these vehicles. Then you got this tiny driveway that holds 4 cars, even 8 cars. It's still not enough. You got 4 to 6 cars going on that street. Where do they park? On the front lawn? That's what I would suggest, but people don't do that. Municipal parking lot's an inconvenience because it's 1.5 miles, 2 miles down the road during a blizzard. That's something, maybe 30, 35 years ago, people didn't think like that because there was still plenty of land. Well, I think all of us could agree there was a heck of a lot more land back then than there is now. Now, with the density, and we got 250 to 300,000 cars coming through our city a day, that's a problem. And I think we're all on the same team with, we should have the foresight to look down the road, 10, 15, 20 years down the road and say, you know what? Foresight. We saved a lot of people a lot of heartache and a lot of agita by thinking this through and eliminating that. Because if we didn't, we'd be beyond stuffed. The bag would break. So that's something that also keeps me up at night with something like this. And I would ask you would keep that into consideration. Thank you.
Dave?
I remember 10 or 15 years ago on Pearl Street, that big apartment complex, they're trying to pull a shenanigan on us. Right, I didn't want to use their name. But they bought up the houses, the single-family houses, and they were trying to, well, of course, their claim was different than this, but they were kind of claim that any land they bought that was adjacent to their 40B project would itself become part of the 40B project, and they could do this thing. They lost at the end, and your 2 iterations ago of the Alderman Ciriello was the person who really fought it. But it was the first time I saw the game, really saw the game where they weren't really playing by the rules that were in place, but they were trying to make us think that they were. And, you get into the right land court, maybe you end up with what you say you can do. That's what I always get afraid of, is that you get into the courtroom and anything's possible. So what's the downside of taking this off the table? Do you see any downside? Does the city lose anything? Just saying, we don't need this.
I personally don't see a downfall, and I've spoken to Commissioner Quinn. I don't know how much time on this. Neither one of us see a downfall. Quite honestly, if there's a parcel of land, 15,000 square feet, and somebody wants to build a $1.5 million home, they just look at the setbacks and they just pop the foundation within that. I'm okay with that. But when you take 15,000 square feet and you blow it up to 3, 4 units, that's something. It's, you know, and that's not only a tax on our infrastructure, that's also a tax on our schools, okay? Drainage, you know, fire department, first responders, patrol, salt, sand, plowing, you know, navigating the water supply, another, you know, loop system, you know, trying to, you know, gain the pressure that we need to keep all of these units, you know, fed properly. There's a lot of downsides to leaving it. The downsides of eliminating it, I would only say that it's probably the developer not making as much money as he possibly could. That's the only one. Thank you.
So I've got more in the way of, oh, there's the rescue coming, hold on. So a great conversation, and I hope to add to it by maybe giving a couple of pieces of info and a couple of ideas about ways maybe moving forward that it could work. So I hear and I understand all those comments, and I'm thinking about the ones that Lou just made about a 15,000 square foot lot that gets 3 or 4 units added to it. And those kinds of developments are happening everywhere, but they're not cluster. And there is the one cluster that we had, but there are a lot of townhouse developments. There are, if the concern is, and the city needs to have this conversation, but there are other provisions in the zoning ordinance that are creating far more units than the cluster has so far. There's a townhouse section of the zoning ordinance that if somebody has 18 acres, they can do a townhouse with a special permit from the council. There's also a line in the table of uses in the zoning ordinance that allows townhouse developments in 2 of the 4 residential districts, again by special permit, but it allows it. And those are in fact the provisions that developers have been using for the last 10 or 15 years for the 2 that are on East Dexter, the first and second one that Seaver did, the one that the development Seaver did on Shannon Farm, the old Shannon Farm. He used the townhouse development. So when the city thinks about the utility of the cluster ordinance, I think it also needs to look at those other provisions to see whether they are appropriate as well, because they are in fact creating far more in the real world than the cluster has to date. I think the cluster ordinance that's on the books now probably hasn't been used because it's not, I don't know the whole inventory of clustered provisions across the state, but it struck me as unusual when I looked at Woburn's, because cluster is supposed to be a carrot to have a development that does have usable, worthwhile open space. No more units than could be in a regular subdivision. Sometimes they give a little bit of a bonus, but typically it's not a lot more units than you would have had under a conventional subdivision. You want to encourage them to think things differently and shrink the footprint of the land disturbance smaller than it otherwise would be in favor of keeping the open space. And that's typically what happens, but you're right. There's nothing in the ordinance right now that seems to give any way to measure and require quality open space. And certainly, taking a look at the ordinance would fix that. What's unusual about the ordinance in Woburn is that it really isn't the incentive that it typically is in other places, because it actually requires 2 approvals. If you want a cluster subdivision, you first have to come to the planning board and get a roadway system approved under subdivision control, and then you go to the city council and see if you can get a special permit. So the nature of being a 2-step process with 2 approvals in and of itself kind of makes it unattractive for most. As to the issue of parcel assembly, that does happen everywhere. It's probably in someone's mind in Woburn. I think it happened in the location that was going to be the subject of the next cluster if it had gone forward. There are ways that that issue could perhaps be addressed. I don't know why you couldn't have in your ordinance a provision that said that the parcels that were qualified for cluster were those that as of a certain date had 5 acres or more. So you would avoid a situation where somebody would buy 1 acre, 2 acre, and 4 acre. They would have needed to have 5 acres, say, as of the date you adopted the revised cluster subdivision. So it's something certainly to explore as a possibility to ensure that you're not somehow incentivizing people to assemble parcels and create new developments. On the other hand, I can see where it, in certain circumstances, you might want to permit that, but if the overarching concern is in the other direction, then maybe you are a little conservative and set the minimum or set a certain date by which it had to be a parcel of record, and if it comes after that, then it's not going to qualify to even apply for the ordinance. It certainly does need work as it's currently written, but the downside that I see to taking it off the books is an interesting one, and it's one that I can't really quantify for you, and that is that there's been at least one, and I racked my brains to try to remember what it was, and I can't, but there's at least, when we apply for grants, they sometimes will ask questions, depending on the nature of the grant. They will ask you things about the local community. Do you have an ordinance that allows cluster subdivision? Do you allow multifamily? Do you allow accessory apartments by right? And in some grant applications, those answers are scored. If the goal in particular grant is improving open space, then they might ask questions about whether you have a cluster subdivision ordinance on the books to try to encourage the creation of more of it. So there is a scenario potentially, if you take it off the books, and if the city were to apply for a grant, it's conceivable that some grants, you might not get the maximum number of points, or you wouldn't get as many points because you didn't have a cluster. But frankly, I think that's probably the only immediate problem, if you will, that I could see with repealing it. I guess, too, the possibility that you might be inadvertently, even though you can't avoid it, there is that possibility that somebody could try to freeze the zoning and file a plan to freeze the cluster that's in place that would simply allow them to apply in the future for cluster, but you might get that initial rush of people maybe trying to freeze the zoning. We had that a couple of cases up in the Commerce Way when we were talking about changing, I think, the maximum density and the number of units. It was either that or we were thinking about increasing the amount of affordability. We had a couple of filings up there where people froze the zoning, so it's not an idle threat, it can happen. So this is one of those amendments where I can't say that it would be a horrific thing to take it off the books. I don't think there's a lot of people using it, but I do think that it has value, and the city really ought to think about maybe it doesn't need a townhouse and that line in section 5.1 that I mentioned, and a cluster. Maybe it rethinks it, it comes up with one ordinance that does it much better, and sort of in one piece of legislation, as opposed to several that are scattered. Each one has a little bit different requirements, so it's not consistent across the board. I guess those are my initial thoughts.
Claudia?
So to respond to Tina, if, for example, one way of dealing with the concern about assembling small lots into one big lot was to amend this, for example, to say, okay, if you don't have 5 acres by X date, then you can't apply. But could someone freeze the prior zoning ordinance?
Yes,
They
if they,
could, but if they don't have 5 acres,
it won't help them if they don't have 5, right? They need at least 5.
because if you freeze the zoning, you have to go forward within a certain amount of time, don't you? Right,
Yeah, it's 7 years, it's some period of time.
yeah.
7 years with an approved definitive plan.
So it doesn't really take care of the zoning freeze issue, simply amending it is kind of where I'm going with that. Like, yeah, you could amend it to change just that part of it, but then there's still the zoning freeze issue to go forward on. So when I think of planning, I think of the city council as the folks that set the policy. The people elected, the councilors, to affect the big choices. what does the city look like? What sort of buildings are built here? What sort of neighborhoods do we want to see? And we as planners, I think, take a more technical approach. We try to implement a vision in a correct way that doesn't result in things coming at us that we didn't expect. So in terms of policy, if the city councilors look at this and think, okay, you know, we see Quail Run, we don't see another Quail Run here for whatever good reasons, right? That to me says that this zoning ordinance should be repealed, because if that was what it was designed to do, and the policymakers in the city say, we really don't see that happening again, and it can be used in a way that we don't want, then I would say it makes sense to repeal it, right? Just because the policy is not to have another Quail Run. And what Tina is saying is, well, if what the developers really are doing is looking to the other townhouse provisions, right, to bring multifamily into the city, which is not inherently a bad thing, but it needs to be done in a way that sort of supports the vision of the elected folks, right? And if this doesn't do that, yes, we can repeal it, and yes, we can also think about how to make the zoning ordinance better for multifamily in other ways, like fix it in other ways, and still repeal it. Do you see where I'm going with that? Like, if we really don't see this happening again, this Quail Run situation, then it's on the city to fix their zoning, but you can do that separately from this piece of it. So those are my thoughts on your thoughts, Tina, so.
May I, Chairman? Thank you all. This is exactly what we were hoping for, this kind of dialogue. I'm still concerned about keeping this on the books for the reasons that you stated about policy and our constituency and the people that we talk to, that we report to, and what their vision of Woburn is. I would like to see us repeal it and then go to work, and if it really does add a lot of value in terms of potential grants, I don't know what that number is, but maybe we can get that. Rewrite, throw the whole thing out, rewrite it from scratch. With eyes that are in 2024 and not 40 years ago. And the other things in our ordinance, when we take them one at a time, we can't take them, you know, in a big group. But that's just my thoughts on it. I really think this ordinance is old. It's not doing what it was intended to do anymore, and it can cause us harm. And I will ask you to please repeal it. Thank you.
I'd just like to mention that, you know, Tina, you brought up a great point, or points. You know, if we already have areas in the city that are zoned specifically R2, R3, developers can make use of that currently. If you can use currently townhouse type layouts, it's already on the books, they can still use that. We have, I believe, in place enough for housing ordinances currently on the book. And I understand that it's the big thing today. They want more and more and more and more and more. But we're literally going to crowd ourselves out. And we're not going to be able to sustain it. There's already enough on the books. If the cluster development ordinance hasn't been used in 30 years plus, then maybe that's the one that we cut loose. If we have these other ordinances already being implemented and utilized, according to you, currently, with projects that have been approved, that are in the pipeline, that are being done and signed off, I would ask, isn't that enough? If we've already got it, and if you already have an R2 zone, and, you know, a developer has pulled together several parcels and said, geez, I have 3, 4, 5 acres, then fine. It's zoned for R2, build your R2s in accordance to, you know, the building codes and the ordinances that are in place. And if you did need a special permit on that for whatever reason, then you come to us and we set up the conditions and then that's it. But R2. But it just seems with this ordinance, it's greed. And I don't want to sound like a movie, but it is greed because you've already got an R2 in place, but you want 3 and 4s. You can put 17 units in there, but you want 25 or you want 30. 17 should be it, because that's what we currently have on the books that makes sense, that's being utilized. It doesn't seem to give us much of a hassle. This other thing that's been, you know, dormant, it's like almost a hornet's nest. This thing comes into play, this could be a problem. And again, because of lack of land and just the growth that we're having and people's desire to be here. Thank you.
Yes, Mark.
Mr. Chair, just, you know, I don't want to just jump on what everybody else is saying, but I totally agree. I think what's in front of us has merit, and I also agree with it. It's also an opportunity where we could reflect on what we currently have as far as other cluster ordinances. You know, Alderman DeMambro brought up a good point where, you know, it's almost an ordinance like this, you envision, oh, a nice meadow off here, little subdivision and nice open space, but that's not what happens. He brought up the point where the open space is garbage land. You can't do anything with. And I think an ordinance like this is just a disguise where they could take that garbage land and incorporate it to make something bigger on the good land that's there. That's kind of how I envision it. I wouldn't have a problem, you know, striking this from the record at all, but I would also caveat that with, let's look at what we also have, like Tina had mentioned, the other townhouse cluster developments. Can we kind of, I guess, work with that to kind of combine, consolidate, whatever, to kind of get a better handle on this, so we're not force something down our throats that we don't want.
If I could just
Oh,
add to that.
please, yes.
I like your idea, and I'm thinking the same thing in terms of the townhouse one. It's very similar. It requires 50% open space, I think, preservation. It's a city council special permit, doesn't have a planning board process, but that's typical. 18 acres is a strange number. Somebody must have had 18, but not 20. But you know, the right number might be 10. It's to your point about thinking about what's in the city, what's left, where it might be appropriate for that kind of thing. So I would hope that the city would take a look at the townhouse, because the issue there, I think, of the quality of the open space is a fair one, not to pick on one, but I'm thinking of the one that Seaver did on Lexington. There was a big swath of open space, but it's under high tension wires, and there's no trees on it. So you can play wiffle ball on it, but, you know, I'm not sure they'd let you put a bench or anything like that as an obstruction in it. There is a path, but not much more. So it might be worthwhile taking a look at that ordinance, and maybe it is, you never do cluster. The townhouse is a form of cluster. It's just called the townhouse development. And the last thing I guess I'll say is the timing is all pretty good in that, I say that because I'm not going to be here. The master plan, every community is encouraged to have a master plan, and that they update it every 10 years. And it so turns out that Woburn's master plan expires this year. So a question like this is a perfect one, and we'll have the venue for discussions and research to think about whether or not there's a better way of doing the ordinances we have, whether they should all go, if that's sort of the will of the community. there'll be that opportunity, I think, through the master plan process, whenever it takes place.
Okay, this is a public hearing, and I don't know if I can hold off the mass among public here now.
I don't know.
We're going on any longer, but is there anybody in the audience that would like to speak either for or against this particular proposal?
Let's guess.
Last chance. So, I understand about wanting to take a look at the townhouse ordinance, but again, and the master plan, but I would urge you to take action on this tonight.
Oh, yeah, I'm not suggesting that we hold off.
Oh, gosh,
I
okay, I'm
apologize.
sorry, I
No,
misunderstood,
I apologize
Tina.
to you.
You've heard all of our concerns. Those concerns aren't just our personal concerns. Those are concerns that our constituency expresses to us. So I'm hopeful that you will take action one way or the other so it can find its way to the city council. Thank you.
Okay,
Motion to close the public hearing.
There's a motion from Claudia to close the public hearing, second from Dave. All those in favor? 6-0 passes. Public hearing is closed on this particular subject. Any other discussion, board members? Tina, do you have any kind of a recommendation on this? Or-
Well, you know, I'm just torn. I mean, I guess the chances of the city applying for one of the grants that happens to ask this question is pretty small. And if there was a situation like that, and the answer was no, and you lost a point or two, maybe it's not a big thing. That doesn't mean you're not funded. So, because the downsides are fairly minimal and unlikely, I guess I would have to recommend that the planning board consider supporting the notion of taking Chapter 10 off the books, Section 10 cluster, and then reserving it for future use.
So moved.
Second.
For discussion?
Dave, second by Claudia, discussion.
So we're recommending to the city council that they strike this ordinance, okay. Just want to make sure, all right.
All right, so we have a motion to repeal this particular zoning ordinance. All those in favor?
Well, it's to send a recommendation.
Send a recommendation to repeal the zoning ordinance. All those in favor? 6 in favor, 0 against.
Can we caveat that with, no, I'm good with that, forget it, I'm good.
Wait any time. Okay, all set.
Thank you very
You.
much.
Thank you. To all
And
the
we
board
will
members,
get to
thank
work,
you.
Tina, on those suggestions.
Yes.
The committee will get to work.
Wonderful,
We'll connect with Chairman Demers and get going on those two.
wonderful.
And if there's any way we can be helpful. Back in the day, well, I do know that we're volunteering for work, you know, that I get, Darlene. Back in the day, we had a zoning committee. Yeah, that had joint membership, you know, that had everybody sitting around a table and having these discussions. And, you know, obviously, we're, you know, at your disposal if you think that's a good idea for the future.
I do, if you're willing to
Yeah,
help.
for sure.
I know everybody here
I look
is
forward to it.
doing a million different things, so we'll take you up on that.
Yeah, but I just wanted to extend that offer, because somehow, you know, in the midst of the past, that, you know, ended up not happening anymore, but, you know, we're here for you. So if you
Thank
think,
you so
if
much.
we can help you, call on us.
And again, I apologize that we didn't reach out in advance, but it was quite deliberate. We wanted it to be an open conversation, and we appreciate everything you all do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Were we kind of forced to close Zork?
Yes.
Something happened in which they said you can't really do that? With Zork.
Yeah, somebody was questioning the status of legality.
Meeting and a vote on it.
I will say that the new mayor has mentioned at least 2 times that he is very interested in reconstituting Zork. So I would look forward to him working with the new solicitor to perhaps
I think
make
it
that
would
happen.
just simply have to be done in the right way.
I think so
Oh,
too.
like whatever enabling, you know what I'm saying? Like
There's
it may-
advisory committees everywhere in
Yeah,
every community.
exactly. I mean, there's certainly ways to do that, that does comport with the city charter or, mass general laws or things of this nature. So if folks wanted to do that, as planners, I think our role is to help wherever help is requested.
Right on.
And I think the discussion at the time had nothing to do with what we were doing, but how it had been constituted. So, you're right, there's a way to get around it by calling it whatever.
Yeah, but, we want to be on record as being of service to other parts of the city government that wish to do some, awesome planning, right?
Yeah.
That's what we do.
Okay, up next, 24 Flag Street subdivision.
Yes,
Expiration of construction completion dates, approval of requested revisions to plan of trees to be preserved, and update on completion of remaining work.
yes, so this discussion started in December. George Gately, the developer, was here, gave us an update and had requested, and has on the table, a request for an extension of his completion date to the end of November of this year. At the time he made the request, we sent it to the engineering department for comment like we always do. And engineering reported that they were starting to get a little bit concerned about the amount of the bond. You hold $44,400 as surety to guarantee completion. And we like to hold that plus a little bit of contingency. And that number was estimated by engineering to be $60,000. And again, we were holding 44,400. So in December, we asked Mr. Gately if he would consider posting the difference of 15,600, excuse me, so that we would have the full 60. And in the interim, I also work with them. You recall, one tree was taken down by mistake, another one was dying. I worked with the Assistant Public Works Director. We confirmed that the dying tree was in fact going, so he was allowed to take that down, and I have an email from him. We agreed on, I can't recall what they were, but we agreed on a species of tree that he would reinstall 2 of them in the locations that had been disturbed. So I'm grateful that Mr. Gately actually considered our request, and earlier this week had a check dropped off in the amount of $15,600. So I am going to recommend to you that the board accept that check in that amount as additional surety to guarantee completion of the 24 flag, and that you also, in exchange for that, extend his completion date to, I believe it was November 24, 2024.
Okay,
So moved if you're accepting motions.
I am accepting motions, yes.
Second.
A motion to accept the director's recommendation made by Claudia, second by Jim. All those in favor? 6-0 in favor. Okay, planning board directors
Update,
update. I was gonna say last update, but
No.
it's not the last update.
next to
Next one
last.
will be the last update. Okay.
Swan Song is the next one.
Okay.
So, a couple of things just to mention to you this evening. Our next meeting is on March 12th. Agenda items that night are going to include the continued public hearing on the Marcy Street subdivision, a public hearing on the zoning amendment for murals, and a discussion of completion of the Sherman Terrace subdivision. That had a number of issues, including a turnaround that wasn't placed in the exact right location. It was smaller than what was approved. There were some issues about some of the construction in the lots not matching what was shown on the plan. And they were due to come back for that discussion this evening, but the attorney representing the developer for Sherman Terrace has handed the case over to a new attorney who'll be representing the developer going forward. And that new attorney was not prepared and up to date to come to the meeting this evening, so we're gonna hope to have him in on the board meeting on March 12th. The one other thing I wanted to mention to the board was just to get a sense from you on A&R endorsements. You recall that when we were in the pandemic, of necessity, we authorize the chair and the vice chair to individually sign A&Rs on the behalf of the planning board. And we've used that off and on, particularly, obviously, a lot when the pandemic was raging, and a couple of times when we've had virtual meetings other than that. But I want to sort of reestablish for the board what I think, your past practice has always been that we bring A&Rs to the meetings, and you meet roughly every 2 weeks, so that's typically not an issue. And so I wanted to be able to clarify what the board's policy is with A&Rs. While I think it's still helpful and handy for the planning board to authorize the chair and the vice chair to endorse A&Rs on occasion, I think the practice that you would like to see, I'd like to hear from you what you would like to have, but my guess is that A&Rs should, as a matter of routine and practice, come to the planning board as they used to at your regularly scheduled meetings. And I'm raising it because we did have someone who was inquiring about filing an A&R. They haven't yet, but he was a little bit upset at having to wait, the prospect of waiting for a board meeting, because his engineer had told him, well, I thought now the planning board just has the chair or the vice chair sign, and they can do it for you. And so it would be great for me to be able to clarify if that gets said in the future. Well, yes, that's the way we used to do business, but we've reverted back to what our past practice has always been, which is A&Rs come to the board for full discussion in front of the majority, and a vote gets taken at a meeting. Am I right? That's what you would prefer?
I think so, especially if it's being brought up to us in that way.
Yes,
That I think is not appropriate.
I didn't
So
either.
if it's clear that we did that in response to pandemic era issues that really no longer drive that decision, then I think going forward especially, that would be better practice.
Me too.
That's just me. Anybody else?
Well, I thought the only time we did that was under certain circumstances, whether it was gonna be during the summer months when we weren't gonna have a June or July meeting, or July and August meeting, whatever.
Yes.
But, or in the pandemic when we did it. But other than that, I've never considered it to be the policy that the chair and the vice chair were the ones that signed it. I just kind of figured it was all of us that did it under normal circumstances.
And I think it should be. It should always be when it can
Those were
be.
just exceptions to, rather than make them wait July and August, okay, we'll do this for you.
Exactly. And that's appropriate, and that's something that you would maybe think about in June like you used to do. Traditionally, you would take that vote in June, and it would be good to your September meeting.
Right.
And that's something you should probably definitely consider doing, because you only have 21 days to deal with an A&R. So if one does get filed, you're going to have a special meeting to deal with it, absent something like that. So I thank you for the instruction and the idea, at least the confirmation of what I thought was true, and the lack of objection from the rest of you, I'll take as agreement. So we will be very clear with future applicants.
So my only question is, back when we took that vote, was the wording of the vote like, for the foreseeable future, we will do this? I mean, I guess that's a long way of saying, do we need to vote to revert to our policy based on however we voted to put this in place in the first place?
I'm gonna, if you don't mind, I'm gonna ask Karen, do you remember, because I know you looked at the last letter earlier today.
I did, I almost want to say it's a emergency, but I'm not positive. I can email it to you.
Well, I mean, we could fix it by simply taking a vote.
Right?
Right. We could do
So-
that March 12th if we find we need it.
And it did say, it did say specifically Chair Claudia Bogan and Vice Chair Mike in the letter that we had, so we would have to do a new one anyway. But it said Chair Claudia Bogan
Right.
in that letter.
Right, so Bob Doherty right now is not authorized to sign, endorse an A&R on his own. Mike conceivably could as the vice chair, but we're not going to do that. We're gonna instruct them to come to the board. I'll look at the language. I think we're well out of it, but if we're not, we'll put something on the agenda for March 12th. I'm also gonna go back and look. I know that the membership hasn't changed, but it's been a few years now, maybe 2018, we last filed with the Registry of Deeds a list and signatures of all the board members, so they would have a record of who could sign subdivision plans and such for the board. I'm gonna go back and look at that too. I don't know that if we specified a chair and a vice chair, we might need to renew it, but if we just listed 7 members, no one's changed, so what we have is still valid. I'll figure that out too by the next meeting.
Great.
Thank you. That's all I had for my report.
Gotta add that to your list of things to do.
Yes. Yes. Long list, short on time.
In front of us, we have draft minutes from January 9th.
Motion to approve the January 9th meeting minutes?
Motion by Jim to accept the January 9th
Second?
minutes, seconded by Mike. All those in favor? 5, 6, 0 passes.
Thank you.
Anything else?
Not from staff.
Okay. I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn at 8 o'clock on the dot.
Motion by Claudia to adjourn. Like a second on that? Second by Dave. All those in favor? 6-0. That's it.
That's it.
Listen, there's
What you
a
wrote.
rule. Motions to adjourn are always in order.